So around here they have lots of, in the dark web they have lots of like discussions about that MK Ultra shit. And so I actually am an expert at that stuff. And that one of the things that doesn't necessarily get talked about from that type of stuff is the emergence of certain people that basically have a high probability of being people that probably came from the MK Ultra project. So let me give you an example of what the MK Ultra psychopaths are like. They basically espouse ideas about multiple wives a lot of the times. They usually attempt to run whatever group they control as a dictator. They usually will espouse like this white supremacy, I'm not a monkey, no evolution kind of stuff. And that they usually are people that usually are somewhat obsessed with guns and shit. And that then they're usually pretty decently experts at building convincing lies and stuff. And that then essentially they're usually skilled at the pedophile grooming methods of brainwashing. And then a lot of times, like when I talk about deprogrammings, they'll essentially once you lock them into a logical denial, that's essentially where most of the sociopaths will refuse to accept reality. Even they'll attempt to battle in an intellectual way, feeling like they're the smartest or something. And then when you, essentially it's called fucking them in the corner, basically. And then when you're able to intellectually, on their intellectual level, to be showing how they're wrong about something, then they'll just refuse to accept reality. That's indicative of those people. Usually these type of people are able to be pretty decently educated. The thing about David Koresh is that he seemed to exhibit a memorization ability. See, this is the type of stuff where I have a conceptual photographic memory. See, I don't memorize. I remember concise concepts very, very efficient. And so this is where, in lots of ways, the things that happen to me, with somewhat the potential, somebody that gets put through that stuff has the potential of turning into this. I've taken a completely different path because as a child, I basically saw people that represented this. They memorized data. I essentially remember concise analysis. And so this is where the things that I do differ in most ways from these type of people. And so in ways it gives me a unique ability because a lot of what they basically are is somewhat of a diametric to me. That extreme diametricness gives me an increasingly easy ability of seeing people that essentially would be completely diametric to me. See, I attempt to strive to be the most anti-psycho, where these people essentially strive to be the most psycho, and that's the kind of stuff that I notice, because essentially people that get put through the childhood satanic sex slaving kind of stuff, they're not supposed to be striving to be psycho. And see, I know that. And so when I see them do things that are like indicators of groomings and trainings of childhood SRA, I'll notice them doing what that stuff is incorrectly. And so that's just I have an ability because essentially I would do the opposite of what these psychos would be doing. Basically. And so that's like where memorizing data, that never made sense. I have a theoretical belief that, well, one time Einstein said that he wouldn't memorize his phone number because he could just look it up in a phone book. That made all the sense in the world. That's like why I hate chemistry. Because everybody has to memorize the fucking polymer chains and shit like that. And that's data memorization, and it goes against my whole fucking theoretic. See, the concept, the mathematical concepts in chemistry, that's the stuff that I comprehend. And with some small, like, restudying or something, I'll be able to comprehend that stuff again really easily. That's the kind of stuff that I remember. People that sit there filling their brain with memorizations and shit, that stuff gets in the way of conceptual free thought. That is where these people, when they end up being like this, a lot of times their inability of doing conceptual free thought is deadened by this memorization stuff. It gets in the way of them having the ability of conceptually building new theoretics and stuff like that. They essentially adhere to what they memorize without any ability of adding to or branching out kind of stuff. So the whole idea is that these groups, people who do this stuff, this type of stuff, they essentially nowadays kind of do an S&M called Big Love. And then some might do a variant Amazon version, is what they call it, called Lizard King. And essentially what they attempt to do is to be a Roman Grant compound. Basically, it'll start up and usually like a semi-city country aspect, like as you start to get away from the inner city, basically it'll start to be like country-ish, but there'll be richer houses around and stuff. It'll have like more whole acres with a nicer house and horses and orchards and shit like that. In those areas, they attempt to figure out ways to push out everybody that's not a part of this. And then they attempt to build a subversive compound subversively without anybody noticing. And then they essentially start to build a Roman grandchild bride and multiple wife society. Okay? See, one of the things about Satanism is that child brides and multiple wives are a part of Satanism. So when these Mormons sit around wondering why I call them Satanists, it's because fundamentalists do multiple wives and child brides like Satanists. And then the Mormon temple sits around with Mormon security calling themselves wizards, and then they hide everybody doing this stuff out of their Mormon temple. So essentially, out there in West Richland, they essentially have this. And nowadays it kind of pulls away, but this little classic rock aspect and the Lizard King, in ways they'll classic rock version of Roman Grant in Big Love. And so, this is the kind of stuff that exists. These people are the ones out in West Richland. They're the ones that traffic children from Mormon fundamentalist camps in Mexico and Canada to do their fundamentalist rituals and shit. And so, what they may not ever seem to comprehend is whatever their compound methods are will easily fall into already existing ideas. Like Jim Jones is would be like the most classic rock Lizard King version of a compound, the most hippiest version. And that then David Koresh would basically be the least hippiest version of a Jim Jones compound. And you see that what most people don't realize about Satanism is that David, to do that Satanism, where Jim Jones would have already been around, that's where he would have had to do his own different version of Satanism. So he essentially would have done a lesser version of the hippie Jim Jones. And then Jim Jones essentially would have done this version. And that essentially what they were doing is basically the same idea. A lot of this stuff deals with theoretical difference in imagery, and essentially this person would have been like less hippie and more just like classic rock or something. And then Jim Jones was more hippie and more flower people kind of a person. And that's essentially what kind of defines them differently. This type of stuff represents like where this is where essentially most of Jim Jones's world would have done like lesser pedophilia or something as their satanic ritual. And then David Koresh, all of his people would have done more satanic ritual pedophilia. And the ritual itself is essentially this is the lesser version of this. And so, and that essentially what leads these people to suicide is that then they attempt to do this, and then that fucks up everything because it gets noticed, and then everybody commits suicide. And then these people start having all their weird fundamentalist prairie bonnet people touching kids in front of everybody on the internet. And then that's what leads them to essentially on a path to suicide. In like a Jim Jones way. But more than likely, these type of people would have been like, they'll probably be murdered for doing basically whatever they were doing. These people, they would have committed suicide. So it's like Jim Jones would have been suicide. David Koresh, essentially, those people blew him up. That's like murder, basically. And so that's kind of like the reason things pan out like this is because these people would have just known that it was the end, and they would have just killed themselves. That was their psyops. To just always be, they always would have known that if the government like flew in and showed up and then they killed a congressman or something, they would have known that it was the end. These people essentially would have had a theoretical, they would have known that it's the end, but then instead of killing themselves, they start battling against the government. And that's why it leads to, that's their the theoretical approach of that type of shit, where these people give up, these people battle until death. And that's the difference between their little satanic cults. And so nowadays, what you have is people that essentially emulate one or two of these. And that is where what comes of this is like people that are Mormon fundamentalists that are like revolutionary and like want to secede from the Union and shit, and they want to battle the government, and then they espouse these like dumb Tea Party ideas and shit. And then you have a bunch of masochist groups that essentially are just waiting around for some sort of indicator that essentially it'll have them like committing suicide. And that this is essentially like the Amazon Lizard King groups, and that the whole idea is that they're like a soft pedophile accepting group that would, in a more modern tech nerd way, would be kind of like the free-spirited hippie version of tech nerds, kind of. And these people are like the militant, like Tea Party QAnon kind of people. And so they, in Pasco, have like a theoretical area that they're trying to build into a subversive compound also. And that is like where these people do these Nazi S&M apps. That's kind of where they're built for this. I mean, you gotta think about it. Neo-Nazis created the like S&M apps that they're using for this stuff. And that those people, they base things off of like, it's called MK Ultra in this country, but the shoots and stuff, okay? And so a lot of that is involved with like, here's like pedophile Jim Jones and David Koresh were like pedophile versions of that shit. And that essentially in Nazi Germany, they would have made societies that would operate theoretically in these kind of a way, in these ways. And so what most people don't understand is that Nazis don't necessarily go around blabbing about this shit. But that's where the even biker groups are basically kind of that. And it's like most of the time they're like this, and that's why they're always stockpiling weapons and shit, and all paranoid about revolutions and like Ruby Ridge and shit like that. That's like the theoretical difference. So nowadays people are just using dark webs that essentially pushes people. And see, they like follow the procedures in it. And that essentially the procedures lead them into building either a Jim Jones compound or a David Koresh compound. And see, the masochist groups, they'll eventually want to be in like an isolated, hippie, open relationship kind of compound. Like a helter-skelter compound. And that is where these ones basically push towards isolating out in the woods and stuff like that. And these ones essentially push towards living in the outskirts and the farmlands kind of. And so they all come with, I mean, the whole idea is that these people aren't really do this S&M dark web shit. They're not actually supposed to use those. Those are for the stupid little, like if a biker catches a whole shit ton of dumb little pedophile skinheads, then they usually get one of these, and then they have to go out to a compound, and then they have to build a compound. That's what those are for. And then sometimes the bikers are those people too. But that is like essentially like it's what they have to do. See, most of the time these skinheads are kind of like in a gang, but if they get found being gross little stupid pedophiles, then they end up being forced onto a compound in whatever kind of way represents them and shit. And that's what those are for. And that the whole idea is that the hackers go around ripping that stuff off, and they don't really prevent any of it, and that people that are using it may not realize that when the stupid skinheads start using it, they follow the procedures too, and it ends up pushing them into building a compound. And they usually make a bunch of crank and shit, and then eventually when they all go crazy and schizo from doing this, they have this satanic sex slave each other out of those compounds too, and then eventually the compound itself, everybody kind of turns into a crazy schizo, and then they start fucking up their meth labs and stuff, and then that's usually where a group of bikers just comes in and slaughters them, or then they get told to kill themselves or something. All right, that's so that's why I bring this up, because this is like where people are using those apps and they're not supposed to use those. And that this is what it is. They don't tell you because they use the term ghost. Okay? And that if you're gonna rip off their Nazi pedocuck shit, then just realize that you have to do all the procedures, and that's essentially where this stuff never seems to be a problem for those skinheads, because they follow the procedures and they do what it fucking tells them to do. And that, yeah, they end up just being out there as a group of dudes. And they're not allowed to have women, and they're not allowed to bring children and shit. Essentially, they just go out there making crank and any type of drug chemistry stuff. So, the reality is that if they don't, the reason the skinheads follow it, because if you don't do what it says, then it opens up that the Nazi pedocuck computer program AI that they use to the whole hacker world. And then they get exposed everywhere. And so the reasons that skinheads use those is because they did something really bad, and that those are the Nazis' way of them not getting thrown in a prison as a cover-up. But they're expected to do everything in it, okay? And it's like, they wouldn't do everything if they didn't care about the exposure of all that behavior that got them that app in the first place. So it's designed to expose people for not doing basically what all the skinheads do.